Welcome everyone. My name is Yeva Barshulskaite and I'm leading trade and green transition work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's absolutely lovely to see this amount of people joining us today. I want to welcome all of you to this webinar, How can the WTO rules foster climate change adaptation in agriculture in developing countries? As WTO members ramp up agriculture negotiations ahead of MC14, ISD is organizing this webinar to bring insights from research community on how the WTO rules could support needs of climate change adaptation in agriculture in developing countries, which is a topic that we don't think about enough, I think. So during this webinar, our experts will discuss first the possibilities of identifying adaptation goods in agriculture, making these more affordable and increasing their uptakes by developing country farmers. And second, repurposing agricultural support towards adaptation-friendly crops and practices while avoiding trade distortions and breaching subsidy limits under the WTO agreement on agriculture. There are, of course, a lot of other ways in which WTO rules can foster climate change adaptation in agriculture, for example, through the promotion of transfer of technologies to farmers in developing countries, but we won't have time for that today. So today we just focus on import tariffs on adaptation goods, that is market access, and agricultural subsidies or domestic support, as we call them in the house. Today we have a really stellar lineup of speakers, and I'm really happy to announce that we have Filip Osano, the former Center Director of Stockholm Environment Institute Africa, who will walk us through adaptation challenges in agriculture in developing countries. So just as of to set the scene, afterwards, we will hear from my colleague from Resilience Program, Ms. Katarina Schmidt, who will speak about adaptation goods for agriculture. A lot is being discussed right now about lowering tariffs to make adaptation goods more affordable, but what the goods are that needs that lowering? Is it possible to come up with a list of adaptation goods that work well through different contexts? Or shall we be mindful of different circumstances of different WTO members when discussing that? We'll hear about that from her. And then the last, but really a very much awaited presentation today, we'll discuss agricultural subsidies and adaptation. We have two excellent speakers to discuss that. Lars Brink, a top agricultural trade expert who's probably the most well-versed person on domestic support at the WTO, and David Orden, Professor Emeritus of Agricultural and Applied Economics at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. They're both authors of a landmark book, Agricultural Domestic Support under the WTO. So Lars and David, they will walk us through the WTO Agriculture Agreement, just to help us understand which provisions can help developing countries promote adaptation in agriculture and force adaptation efforts in developing countries. Some housekeeping before we get going. So this is a closed webinar with the WTO delegates and capital-based officials. So we will be recording the first part where presentations are being made, but we won't be recording the second part where you will be posing your questions and comments. So like this, you will have a record of presentations that you can revise later after if you feel that need. But your own participation and engagement will be kept strictly confidential, so you can feel free to jump in, react to the presentations, either now in the chat if you feel so, or later by raising the hand at the second part of our sessions. We will be dedicated to questions and answers. So we want to really have a candid chat with experts where you ask questions, express your ideas. Don't hesitate to do that. Hopefully we'll have around half an hour for this conversation at the end of the presentations. But just in order to facilitate us to get through, you can already start putting your questions in the chat as we go along through the presentations. And like this, we'll be picking them up as soon as we get through the presentations. Last not least, it's very important to know that this closed webinar is also simultaneously translated into French. So bienvenue à tous. Don't hesitate to ask questions to experts, either in English or in French. We'll make sure that this is translated, and there is a corresponding switch button at the bottom of a screen that can help you between the language regime. With this, and without any further ado, I will open the floor to our first speaker today, Mr. Filip Osano from SEI Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And just to say that I have now moved over to the World Agroforestry Center, which is dealing with agroforestry, but previously I was working at the Stockholm Environment Institute. My presentation today is just to offer some thought on what opportunities and challenges developing countries face when it comes to adaptation in the agriculture sector. So we can actually go to the next slide. Yeah, so it's in three parts. The first one is just for me to give some examples around the experience we have in Africa on how countries are dealing with challenges on adaptation in the agricultural sector specifically, but broadly looking at the context of climate change instruments. Then I will look at examples of the work that we've done on export commodity, in this case, coffee from the East Africa that's mostly exported, of course, to the EU. So that's start to discuss the trade element. And then I will also look at how we view adaptation from the lens of transmission of risk, climate risk through trade, depending on which countries are exporting or importing different food commodities. Next slide. Yeah, so maybe just to first explain what adaptation is. So according to the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, adaptation is generally defined as adjustments that are made in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climate changes or climate stimuli and their impact. Now, that means that when you talk about adaptation, we are looking at how individuals, communities, and countries are initiating processes or practices, as well as moderating their policies in response to climate change. Either that can happen before the impact of climate change is experienced, which is anticipatory, or it can actually occur or happen after, which is sort of like an after the impact of climate, any climate hazard, whether it's drought, with a flood, heat waves, and so on. But the thing is, in the climate change discussions, and if you look at the current, even if you look at the Paris Agreement and the agreement we have, a lot of attention has been paid to mitigation, which is a process for limiting or reducing emission of greenhouse gases, the gases that cause global warming. And adaptation has not had that priority at the global level. It's actually often seen as a national level issue. So a lot of attention to adaptation is something that is important for developing countries, and especially countries in Africa. It's very important because some of the measures, adaptation measures that are taken in countries that have relationship, particularly trade relationship with countries in the developing part of the world, have impact and have demonstrated that. So we view, of course, that adaptation is actually also a global issue. And within the United Nations Framework Convention process, there's a process to develop what we call the global goal on adaptation. Currently, we have a global goal on mitigation, which is trying to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade and not less than 2 degrees centigrade. But there's actually no global goal on adaptation. So that's a process that's going on as part of the UNFCCC work. Next slide. So I just wanted to give an example of Africa and how this matters, because when you're talking about climate change, and we're talking about agriculture, and we're talking about food systems broadly, in Africa, we see a diverse kind of farming systems. So there are different food products produced, different regions because of the agroecology. They produce different kind of food products. The key thing to take away from here is that much of food production in Africa currently is based on a rain-fed system. Because it's based on a rain-fed system, it means that with climate change, with higher temperatures, a much warming world, it's affecting food production, because the variability of climate means that currently farmers have a challenge of being able to predict what is the right time to plant if it is if it's food crop. Second thing is that even when they plant with a much warmer temperatures, you find that some of the seeds that they're using might not be tolerant to a higher temperature thresholds. So it means also that technologies for better seeds are needed, seeds that can tolerate maybe much more drought or more frequent droughts. And of course, when you talk about hazards like drought when it comes to livestock, for example, then it's a big problem because you see huge losses of livestock during periods of drought. So different countries and different regions in Africa, of course, are affected differently by climate change. There are countries that are dominant in terms of producing cereal crops, for example, maize. There are countries that are dominant in terms of rice. There are countries that are also very dominant when it comes to livestock production. And so it means that when you look at the national adaptation plans for each of the countries across Africa, and I believe this is more the case also for many developing countries, it speaks to a prioritization in terms of adaptation measures that are directly talking to the priority agricultural production system. So, for example, if you look at a country like Ethiopia, livestock becomes very important, or Namibia, livestock is important, Botswana, livestock is important, and that would be different for a country like, say, Nigeria, a country like Guinea, and so on. Next slide. And just to say that the science to advise policy measures for national level and international level come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you look at the fifth assessment report, normally they produce assessment report almost every 4 or 5 years. So right now, the IPCC has just started the seventh assessment report. If you look at the fifth assessment report and you look at ecological drought, which is the drought that's affecting agriculture, we see that there's quite a lot of increases that is predicted, that's already observed actually within the region of Africa, but also that's predicted. Of course, we have much of Southern Africa, part of Western Africa, a bit of East Africa and Central Africa, that we see a lot more droughts predicted to happen. But I also wanted to say that one of the challenges that is faced, particularly in Africa, is the lack of evidence because of just the fact that there are not enough studies that are being published that can be captured by the IPCC, because IPCC itself doesn't produce research. They actually synthesize research that's already produced. So that means that we quite have a lot of limitation when it comes to data availability, and there are certain instances where we cannot actually have consensus about what the impact would be. So there's a limited agreement. Next slide. Yeah, but talking about drought, so one of the key things that are important, I think Iliava talked about technology. So I talked about the fact that much of agriculture is dependent on rainfall. So irrigation technology is one of those important and critical measures that is important when it comes to adaptation on African agriculture. And of course, there are other technologies like in terms of providing early warning and forecast. There are other technologies like better crops, which I've talked about. But Africa's 10-year strategy for agriculture, so the first strategy was developed for the period 2015 to 2025. They've just developed a new strategy. And if you look at that period between 2015 to 2022, you see that different countries invested differently in terms of increasing the area under agriculture. So you have a set of countries, particularly Sierra Leone, Gambia, Ethiopia, Congo, and Equatorial Guinea, that actually increased more than 150% in terms of the area under agriculture, under irrigated agriculture. And that's important because to build a resilient system, you then have to invest in providing efficient water management, and irrigation is just one of those areas that countries have prioritized. Nearly all countries have prioritized that in their adaptation plans for agricultural sector in the climate adaptation. Next slide. And then I just wanted to say that broadly, if you look at the policies, regional continental policies in agriculture, the common theme that comes is a commitment to ensure resilience of food production systems. So in the agricultural strategy for the period 2015-2025, that was very clear. There's currently a climate change and resilient development strategy for the period 2022 to 2032. Again, agriculture is very important there because for much of sub-Saharan Africa, most of the countries have between 60 to 70% of their GDP really dependent on agriculture. So it creates employment, is important for the national economies and so on. And with climate impact, that becomes a big issue that needs attention. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight a few things in the new strategy for agriculture for Africa, which is for 2025 to 2035. Commitment to building a resilient agri-food system is at the top. One of those things that are being promoted, of course, is in terms of better agricultural land management. I also wanted to emphasize just the need for building capacities for early warning. That is something that has been lacking, and of course that's a global issue, but I think for Africa, when you look at early warning systems, they're still weak, so that's a very important part which is linked to technologies that are required for better early warning and better planning, which can help inform adaptation, particularly for measures like insurance, agricultural insurance products. You see that uptake for that is still very low, so that's important for building resilience. Next slide. I just wanted to give an example of the opportunity that exists, that in some of the measures where climate adaptation in agriculture sector can actually also provide opportunities for trade. Next slide. So I wanted to give an example of coffee. We just done a recent study where we are looking at some of the adaptation measures in the coffee growing areas. And we see that promoting climate smart agriculture, which is better practices that are informing less use of pesticides, less use of, or much better use of natural fertilizer, biofertilizer, mulching, and so on, that those actually do increase yields in coffee systems. But because they're sustainable measures, it actually also provides improvements in export opportunities. So this can then help address climate risk, and then of course allow for much better export opportunities for farmers that are producing coffee because of different requirements, particularly certification requirements in the EU market. But we looked at issues around traceability, issues about labeling, and issues about better phytosanitary measures. Next slide. So I wanted to bring in this up because when you look at the East Africa community, in the EU is a very important market for coffee production. Much of the last decade, we've seen almost a 60% increase in export, coffee export to the EU market. And of course, the leading countries, Italy, Belgium, Germany, Spain, and France, are countries that actually have a trade relationship with the region when it comes to coffee imports. Next slide. I will not go into this detail, but this is just to say that we, after reviewing a number of studies that looked into promotion of agroforestry in coffee system, we actually find that it helps also with what we call mitigation in terms of carbon, storage of carbon, both within the coffee farm, coffee trees, coffee forest themselves, but also in terms of the soil carbon. So that's an opportunity also for carbon trading when it comes to, because I don't know whether you're looking at this, but when it comes to under the Paris Agreement, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement provides actually for trading between countries on carbon market. So that's also an opportunity that can actually be picked up as part of generating income from climate finance, which can strengthen the adaptation for farmers. Next slide. I wanted to conclude by just also bringing some of the work that we've been doing. Next slide. When we look at trade and climate, and one of the ways in which you look at this is to look at ways in which the pathways that climate risk can be moved between different countries, and trade is one of those ones. When you look at flows of commodities, both import and export, and we see that supply chains become very important when it comes to transmission of climate risk, and that has implication on adaptation. Next slide. Yeah, so colleagues of mine, of course, at SEI did this study where we looked at 6 commodities. We looked at rice, wheat, maize, which are sort of like really staples. Those are the most important one, of course, and then soy, sugarcane, and coffee. Next slide. And when you look at this, when you look at these commodities and you look at the impact of climate change, the projected impact of climate change, we see that apart from wheat, nearly all of them are predicted to be having a decrease. Climate change will cause a decrease in the production of these commodities. Wheat is a bit different because different models from the IPCC show that wheat production might increase in the core regions where wheat is produced. But I think when you look at the staple, maize and rice particularly, are very central food products for Africa, and they're very important for food security when it comes to staple food consumption. Next slide. So the analysis just shows that if we look at it from a climate lens perspective, and you look at the issue that there might be reductions in the major producing countries, it means that the countries that import this food product from the producing countries are actually at a risk. And when you look at the national adaptation plans, when we looked at many in Africa, we see that because adaptation has been viewed as a national issue in most cases, the adaptation plans are speaking mostly to just adaptation measures within countries. They don't speak to adaptation measures that are required because of import dependency on food. So if you're importing, say you're importing maize from a country, like one of the maize big producers, Brazil, China, and US, it means that if there's a reduction in maize production in those countries, then it means that your import dependency will also have a risk. So that's something that we are working currently to support countries to just develop adaptation plans, not just based on what happened within the domestic conditions, but also what happens in other parts of the world where the significant important relationship. Next slide. Yeah, so I think this is just by the end. I just wanted to say that an example that we've looked at is rice, and we see for countries in Africa that import rice from Southeast Asia, what's happening is that climate models show that rice production in Southeast Asia, because a highly climate vulnerable region, will reduce. And that means that with a growing population in Southeast Asia, we see that there are periods when even countries that export rice from Southeast Asia then ban export, because they also need to take care of their domestic population. So that means that it's very critical that countries, for example, in Africa, that depends on rice import from countries like Pakistan and India, also in the long term start to develop adaptation measures that are looking at that trade relationship. So I just wanted to conclude here, and I'm happy, of course, just to provide answers for any questions or clarification, and also to just say that many of what I've referred to, we have publications that provide a lot more details that I'm happy to also provide to the people that might want to have a look at and read them. Thank you so much, Leva.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arsana. Look, that has been such a rich presentation. So first of all, for the benefit of all our audience, let me remind you that you'll be able to see and revise those documents later onwards. It's really very rich information that you found in the slides. I found that amazing. And thank you for making this linkage between the food production system resilience and the issues linked to international trade. With this, I think that builds a good bridge to the presentation that will be following and will be done by my colleague, Ms. Katarina Schmidt. And we'll be speaking about the adaptation goods and what can we learn about them from the research that she has been doing. Katarina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much, Philip, for making this great overview of what adaptation is and how it's linked to trade. I think, as Yeva said, my presentation will zoom in now into one very specific aspect and discuss a little bit what this concept of climate adaptation goods is and how it could be useful when then further discussing what trade can do to support countries in the global south in preparing their agricultural sector to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. So adaptation goods. I would be curious as well later if you're familiar with this concept or if this has been coming across. It's from the adaptation perspective, it's also not a very agreed upon concept or a very prominent concept, but one that we're seeing emerging and something that we think is worth discussing and putting forward. So what I'm speaking about is drawn from recent and ongoing research of ISD, looking at how trade can support basically the access and uptake of adaptation goods and services. And here, again, I'll focus on the goods side. So what is an adaptation good? I think the one key message is that I'd like to bring across is that what an adaptation good is really depends on how it's used. So it's not defined by any inherent characteristic, but anything that can be used for adaptation could potentially be seen as an adaptation good, which already makes it very challenging to really define it. To make it a bit more concrete, I've listed here a few examples, and Philip again has already mentioned a couple of them in his presentation. So one that comes up quite a lot, and we're seeing this in adaptation policies across the world, is this aspect of drought-resilient seeds or water-efficient irrigation technologies. That's just something that countries prioritize a lot to, again, adapt their agricultural sector to the impacts of climate change. Desalination technologies to ensure fresh water supplies in the face of sea level rise is another example. And then that was also prominently mentioned by Philip, this whole question of early warning systems that comes with a bunch of technologies, equipment, services to make it available for countries, but it's something that is, again, crucial for adaptation. And these are the final goods, and then obviously you have all the intermediary goods that are needed to produce them. So machinery, spare parts, any technology that's needed to develop these. Next slide, please. Again, coming back to why it's so challenging to define an adaptation good. One is, as I said, it's defined by its usage, but then there's also some risks associated with defining goods as adaptation. Because as Philip had mentioned as well, adaptation is so context specific, and therefore adaptation priorities vary by region. They also vary by time. Adaptation is a process. Climate risks need to be assessed in an iterative way. We all have uncertainties about the impacts of climate change, so it's really difficult to define something to declare something as a static list of adaptation goods. Why do we emphasize this? Because there's also this concept of maladaptation. I'm not sure if that is something that is very, participants are very familiar with. Basically, maladaptation is considered as the outcome of an adaptation measure, but that inherently or inadvertently increases the risk to climate change in the long term, or shifts the risk to other social groups. So, for instance, if a country is promoting a specific agricultural technology for irrigation in a context or in a region that would just be no longer suitable for agriculture at all, or for this specific crop, water-intensive crop in the future, that might create a lock-in effect that's in the end puts people or puts farmers in a more vulnerable position. That's also why it's so important to look critically at this concept of adaptation good, and again, have a flexible and context-specific approach to it. Next slide, please. That being said, we still would like to discuss adaptation goods because we think it's important, and especially when connecting it to trade policies, it's important to be a bit more concrete. So what we'd like to suggest, and very happy to discuss this approach, is to think about it from an angle of saying there are these, it's very context specific, and some of this might lead to maladaptive outcomes, but could we perhaps come towards an approach of talking about so-called robust adaptation goods? We'd like to suggest two ways to come to these. One is, as I already mentioned, this kind of looking at it from context perspective, and from a national policymaker's perspective, use the adaptation processes that are underway. So the NAP process, the National Adaptation Planning process, also the technology needs assessment that is conducted in many countries. That is a stakeholder process to identify adaptation priorities and also related technologies and goods. And again, do this in a iterative way and reassess that regularly. And then the second one, a bit more at the global level, that might be more relevant for this audience here, is to look at adaptation goods that might not be super targeted for a very specific region or context, but that are relevant for a lot of contexts and are also have adaptation benefits in a lot of contexts and in a lot of climate scenarios. So as we've heard before, there are a few goods that are mentioned in many national adaptation policies. as I said, early warning systems is something that is coming up in almost every plan, and it's also something that has a very low risk of maladaptation. So we call this kind of do no harm options or low regret options, and particularly those adaptation solutions that have co-benefits. Philip again mentioned agroforestry, for instance, that might have co-benefits for mitigation or biodiversity or social equity. These are all adaptation goods that could be considered as robust and therefore suitable for developing a more global and general list. Next slide, please. So again, just to make this a bit more concrete, to draw up a few examples that have been integrated in countries' national adaptation plans and that could be considered robust according to the criteria that I just mentioned. So again, climate resilient crop varieties, I think one of the most prominent ones that include drought tolerant, flood resistant, or heat resilient seeds. So for instance, rice varieties that are more tolerant to salinity or to heat, drought resistant maize. These are goods that feature in many countries' national adaptation plans. The other one I've already mentioned, and Philip has mentioned as well, agroforestry seedlings that are drought-resistant tree species, intercropped, have lots of adaptation benefits, but also co-benefits, again, for mitigation and soil health. Early warning system hardware, I already mentioned that, and biofertilizers is also another example that is often cited in different adaptation plans. So just to summarize, these are, just examples. Again, every taxonomy or every list, also the ones that have been drawn up in the past, like for instance by the United Nations Environment Programme or by WIPO, it's all under the assumption that these are working lists and should be dynamic assessments, and again, should be considered in the context of each adaptation challenge. And maybe another key message, and then I'm closing, is that we also know countries have flagged that a lot. Research has shown this over and over, that even access to these adaptation goods, it's not enough. Philip has mentioned that as well. It's really about, it needs to be coupled with capacity development, with access to finance, and really making sure farmers are also, understand it, find it useful, and are able to use it in a way that has adaptation benefits in the future. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the discussion and happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katarina. It's been so interesting, and I'm a bit spoiled with having a pleasure to work with Katarina on a joint trade and resilience project that we're leading in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. We hope that this project will bring a lot more learnings as we proceed through that. But at this point, I don't want to stand between anyone and Lars and David, because they will be doing the double act on domestic support here. And I'm really looking forward to hear from those two people who have been teaching me a lot about domestic support as I was younger and just getting into the subtleties of agricultural subsidies. So with that, I'll probably give a floor to you, Lars and David. Yes, the slides should be showing up in no time, and please start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you for this introduction, and we thank the IISD for the opportunity for David and me to participate in this webinar. And we'll discuss climate change adaptation measures in the context of the Agreement on Agriculture. I will do the first few slides, and then David will present the remaining slides. Next slide, please. We look at the decision responses that are needed in the face of climate change, and they affect both adaptation and mitigation. And both policymakers and agricultural producers need to make the right decisions. The decisions about adaptation generate mostly private producer benefits, and the decisions about mitigation generate public goods. And the decision can affect both adaptation and mitigation, so there is an overlap. And the previous speakers have mentioned maladaptation, which indeed is an important concern. Next slide, please. There is a large literature on adaptation to climate change in agriculture. And policies can make it easier for producers to adapt, and policies can reward producers for adapting. And producers will, of course, also adapt on their own, along with any planned or policy-driven adaptation. And we can also classify adaptation policies in terms of improving the absorptive capacity, the adaptive capacity, or the transformative capacity. Policy support can, in the short run, help a producer absorb or cope with a shock. And in the medium term, the policy can help a producer adapt by making changes in the farm operation. And in the longer term, a policy can support a structural change or a transformation, which could include helping producers to leave the sector. So the question is where this diversity of adaptation policies fits under the domestic support provisions of the Agreement on Agriculture. And what changes could we think of in the agreement, if any changes at all? Next slide, please. The green box of the agreement gives examples of many kinds of services. The government expenditures on these services don't face any limit at all. The services increase the ability of producers to adapt. Think of governments giving local information on weather and on climatic events in the short run and the long run. Expenditures on research help producers to use inputs that are better adapted to a different climate. And the training of producers and those who give advice and their institutions will increase their capacity to adapt. The infrastructural services is a large set of off-farm services that enable producers to adapt. They include, for example, community bodies to manage too much water or not enough water. And also the off-farm networks and infrastructure that are needed to supply energy and information to producers and to transport their inputs and their products. Next slide, please. We know that the green box criteria accommodate a large variety of adaptation policies, but the control of pests and diseases will be more difficult in a different climate. The different climate may bring risks and threats that we don't even know about yet. When producers face really novel threats, it should perhaps be easier to exempt the expenditures as green box services. And in some countries, the pasturing of livestock means moving the herds over long distances in response to drought and rainfall. The climate change can mean that there is a need to adapt away from these traditional patterns of movement. And government services could help the interactions between the pastoral herders and other users of the land. More generally, as climate change affects settled farming everywhere, all producers of crops and livestock face increased risks. So the government can pay a producer who does preventive risk management and who also reduces the risk for other producers. Some examples are control of invasive species or protection against animal disease. And one heading in the green box is about payments under environmental programs. The criteria could be more clear about the eligibility of payments that support both adaptation and mitigation. And the size of the payment is also constrained which can be too tight if there was a need to support more adaptation. And we see a growing interest in making payments based on the results that the producer achieves. The environmental paragraph mentions production methods and inputs. It could be useful to expand the wording to more clearly include also the results-based payments. And with that, I'll leave this and hand over to David. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lars. See if you may not be seeing me yet. I still see Lars myself, but let me thanks to Lars, and also let me add my thanks to ISD, particularly to Facundo Calvo, who's behind the scenes on this seminar, for organizing it and for the invitation to participate. I'm going to turn to the Article 6, which is the other half of the Agricultural Agreement provisions on domestic support. Everyone is familiar in general with Article 6, so the idea here is to look across its components with an eye specifically to where adaptation measures fit in. So let's start with Article 6.5, what's commonly known as the blue box, for which there is no limit on payments with a criteria that these are production limiting programs. For a blue box measure, a government could choose to make eligibility conditional on producers meeting certain adaptation requirements. Since we're outside of the green box, there would be no rules precluding these requirements from being related to input use or to current quantities of production. Payments are unlimited, so levels could be set high enough to provide incentives for producers to participate. Notice here we're not suggesting that any change in the rules is needed. While the blue box hasn't been used very much by either developed or developing countries, Article 6.2 offers additional space to support that fosters adaptation. India has provided the most Article 6.2 support, but many others have also notified support in this category. Now, under quite broad conditions, Article 6.2 allows for provision by developing countries of unlimited investment and input subsidies. Not all such subsidies would foster adaptation, as the literature and the previous presentations today make abundantly clear. But governments can choose those input and investment subsidies that provide adaptation incentives, and the level of those subsidies is again not subject to limit. So this is a second way that adaptation can be supported under Article 6, directly by subsidies as compared by eligibility requirements. Again, no change in rules is needed for governments to use Article 6.2 space to support adaptation. Now, once these two categories of programs are considered, what is left is the residual of measures that are subject to limits under AMSs, the aggregate measurement of support. Let's consider 3 points about the AMS support. First, review of the notifications by developing countries shows that most developing countries that report AMS support report levels well below their limits, which are generally 10% of the value of production, either of specific commodity or of non-product specific support. So for most developing countries, there is space within the AMS limits to expand support to foster adaptation. Now, the idea is sometimes raised of differentiating support so that levels are higher when the product or how it is produced fits into adaptation to climate change. This can be done within the AMS policy space. An example we give here is to offer market price support, but to make eligibility for that support conditional on producers using inputs or practices adapted to new and challenging requirements, similar to imposing requirements for participation in a blue box measure. This, in the case of the market price support, only if you're using adaptation-friendly inputs or practices would create the support differentiation that is sometimes talked about. Now, another important topic that comes up frequently is provision of insurance as an adaptation measure. Producers' ability to bounce back from weather-related devastation is critical to their welfare. Insurance and disaster relief address the absorptive resilience dimension of adaptation that Lars has mentioned and can be provided in green box measures under certain policy-specific criteria. Additional support can be provided under AMSs. The green box criteria can also be reconsidered, as discussed by Lars for other measures, to expand the space for insurance and disaster assistance. So here we are noting the possibility of reconsidering some of the Agreement of Agriculture rules. If I could have the next slide. Okay, well, having undertaken this review, a broad question is sometimes raised of whether there is a need for a unique adaptation box, under which relevant measures would be classified and presumably subject to more lenient limits and rules than other measures. As you can see, we conclude from our review that, and others may disagree, this could be a point for discussion, we conclude from our review that it is unnecessary to negotiate over such a new box at this time. As you can see on the slide, there are two lines of reasoning that underlie this conclusion. And from this, one might draw two takeaways. First, to focus within available space on policies that foster adaptation. And secondly, to bring into the negotiations modifications to the green box rules that would provide further space for adaptation measures. Now, we can also consider the adaptation box question under possible future conditions where agriculture agreement exemptions are fewer and limits tighter. While not an immediate prospect, under such a revised agreement, the issue of an adaptation box would have different considerations. It might become relevant under those conditions of the agreement to exempt some distorting support that fosters adaptation. A second point brings together and generalizes from some of the observations we have made about the green box and possible changes to those rules. This would be to clarify the wording to exempt from limit least trade distorting measures that provide public goods or foster climate change adaptation, even if there is more than a minimal effect on production. Now, in this language, it's proposed language for consideration in a green box, the idea that countries would have to demonstrate that their measures are least trade distorting for certain domestic support objectives borrows from the need to demonstrate under the SPS and TBT agreements that measures undertaken are least trade restrictive in achieving their plant, animal, and human health and safety objectives. Well, let me turn now briefly to, if I can have the next slide. Let me turn now briefly to the issue of adaptation and trade. And I think Philip has really, in his presentation, highlighted in very concrete ways the issues that I'm going to touch on just very broadly and briefly here. So worldwide agricultural production patterns are undergoing climate change, climate-related change, and this will continue as also affected by adaptation. Now, this highlights 2 points. One, that international trade in agricultural products will be more important than ever, and with somewhat more risks. So secondly, it also underscores that resilient domestic production remains vital, it becomes even more important, and this can be fostered by adaptation. If we look at this through the prism of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, with its objective of preventing and reducing distortions in world agricultural markets, then we really underscore the importance within this wide range of ways in which support to encourage adaptation can be fit into the agriculture agreement, really underscores the importance of supporting adaptation in ways that do not overly distort trade. Well, I'll stop there except to, if I can have the next slide, for when the slides are posted, just indicate that we give some references to some recent adaptation-focused articles that we find valuable and important to draw upon, and also to our recent book that was mentioned by the moderator, in which both climate change issues and other issues related to domestic support, both the experience and prospects going forward under the WTO are examined. So thank you.